Bran, our Delph companion, is getting a new set of combat and utility curios in Season 2. And in this video, we're having a look at all of them, and I'll also be ranking them so you know which curios are the best to use, so you can get those easy rewards in Season 2 Delph. Starting with combat curios, we have automatic food bomb dispenser. Throughout the combat, Bran's abilities have a chance to drop 4 food bombs on the field for 10 seconds. You can easily spot them as they have green circles around them, and if you run in, you kick a food bomb at your enemy, dealing fire damage to all enemies in a 6-yard radius. Right? So during testing, a rank 4 would deal around 3 million per hit, and the more mobs I had, the more damage you would do. And actually this didn't seem to be a soft target cap, so even the bigger pools would just evaporate. The fact that you can control when to activate the bomb really made this curio really fun, really engaging. And I think paired up with a massive AU damage, you can deal with a higher mob count. Basically makes this a top-notch curio, and I definitely recommend giving it a go. Next up, we have Goblomagnetic Bouncing Grenade. The easiest way to think about this is just a passive damage bonus to Bran, and with 2 additional effects, it has a chance to stun the target for 1.5 seconds, which proved quite useful in some packs, and there's a 50% chance to bounce to a new target. And it says the grenade can safely bounce on party members, which means technically you can have an infinite amount of damage if you get an RNG procs and it keeps bouncing between yourself or Bran and the enemies. Now, during my testing, it contributed anywhere between 20 and 50% of Bran's damage, which is pretty solid. Personally, I think it's a good choice if you don't want to think about it and just want extra damage done by Bran. Next up is Impact Conversion Matrix. So in a nutshell, the way it works, at the start of a combat, you basically have 20 seconds to deal as much damage as possible, and a small percentage of the damage will be converted to a primary stat for the next 20 seconds. So 20 seconds you deal damage, and then you get a small primary stat buff for 20 seconds after that. During testing, I was getting about 1k primary stat on my Frost Mage, which is really negligible. And the fact that it can only occur once every 2 minutes felt really underwhelming, right? Maybe if it was proccing every combat or every 30 seconds, but at the moment I think this is very undertuned. So avoid this curio, and yeah, wait for it to be reworked or buffed. Yeah, not much else to say about it. Right, next up is Mechasaur Easy Build Kit. Well, this one was pretty fun. Again, don't have to interact as much. So Bran's Epic Egg now houses 4 Mechasaurs that taunt enemies for 10 seconds while within the egg. Mechasaurs will periodically stomp in addition to the usual abilities, dealing moderate fire damage split between nearby enemies. Affected enemies explode after 5 seconds, taking moderate fire damage. So all this does is basically modifies Bran's Egg to have 4 Mecha dinosaurs. Now the downside of this is that the Bran doesn't spawn it as often. Like I would see it maybe like 3-4 times per Delph, but when they do spawn, they're very strong. So what you want to do is you want to spawn those Mechasaurs and try and like blast the Delph as fast as possible, or try and get as much done as possible. The Mechasaurs do huge amount of damage, but it's just they don't spawn very often. So you have to decide whether waiting for that egg and maybe not having that curio for like the first minute of the Delph or 2 minutes, you know, with the bad RNG, if that's worth it. Right, next up, Pinged Augment Chip. Yeah, so basically he's cursed, right? He's getting a damage, you know, an HP buff, but there's like a mechanic you have to deal with. Very easy. There's a small bot that fixates. You can kill it or you can dispel him. If you're playing a healer, then really this downside is not visible at all, and Bran just gets 35%. So I think this is a safe pick as well, depending how much your Bran deals. So depending what level he is, you might decide that this 35% is not actually worth it, or if Bran is doing a lot of damage in your Delph front, you say, hey, another 35% is actually pretty decent. So yeah, it's a safe pick. I wouldn't put it at the top, but it is like just in the next line of picks. Next up is Pocket Factory. So Bran's spells and abilities have a chance to spawn at 3 turrets to assist for 20 seconds. So the 3 turrets are, one is a lightning turret, then there's like a slow turret and a shield turret. The damage basically was kind of average. The lightning turret would cast chain lightning, so the more mobs you had, you know, the more damage you would do. but overall it wasn't anything spectacular. Now, the spawn rate of those turrets was pretty average, and because they spawn like in a static position around Bran, if you had to move away or if the mobs were dead and you were moving into the next pack, basically it would just completely make those turrets useless. So yeah, I think that this is a pretty underwhelming curio. I cannot see a reason why I would pick this over something like, you know, food bombs or a bouncing grenade. Yeah, I would say stay away from this curio for now. And last combat curio is a reverse engineered goblin death bomb. So basically, if you fall below 50%, Bran will throw a grenade, knocking back enemies and healing party members for 80% of their maximum HP. Now, can only occur every 1.5 minutes, right? So it's a weird one. It's a defense curio in a combat slot, and the proc every 1.5 minutes, right? It won't save you if you're really struggling to survive on delves. You need to change something else about your gameplay rather than picking a suboptimal curio. And, you know, it's hard to justify picking this when there's other great options in a combat slot. So I think this curio should be replaced or reworked, maybe like as a third defensive curio slot in future, right? But yeah, at the stand, it has no place, and you know, it's an L curio. I would just avoid this. Now let's look at utility curios, and first up we have Biofuel Rooked Gear. So each enemy slain increases your movement speed by 2% and haste by 2% for 45 seconds, and stacking up to 30 times. Now at first glance this looks like, hey, this is a very good curio, right? It's a 60% haste at max stacks. But what makes this curio unusual is actually this haste is based off the character's haste and not a flat 60% haste increase at max stacks. A character with 10% haste would only get 6% at max stacks, right? And somebody with, let's say, 40% haste would actually get a pretty significant 24% haste increase. So yeah, it's not a flat percent, it's based on the character. So whether this curio is worth it for you or not is really gonna depend on your character, whether you want that haste. And also the fact that it lasts for 45 seconds means you cannot really have, you know, breaks in delves or prolonged fights where you cannot refresh. Maybe this curio is good for somebody who holds W and just clears the delve very quickly, slaying lots of enemies and benefiting from haste. Another cool trick you can do is actually you can kill critters and refresh the duration, so that's something to be wary of. But yeah, it's pretty good curio. I have a feeling it won't be strong early in the season, or maybe you're gonna go a little bit slower in the delve. But yeah, overall pretty decent curio if your character is good with haste. Next up is Comically Large Magnet. When Bran uses Gathering Tool, there is a 100% chance to magnetize discarded plating to party members, granting them 20% of their maximum health as a shield that regenerates out of combat. So straight up, I see two issues with this curio, right? So the first one, again, it gives you no offensive, you know, modifier. It's just a defensive curio, right? It's gonna make your delve slower. I do not see why anyone would pick this over, you know, again, just a damage increase or something that boosts your damage and makes the delves faster. And another reason, right, you're not gonna get any benefits of this curio at the start of the delve. You first need Bran to go and collect some ore or herbs, whatever. So, you know, and sometimes there's synergy, there's not many herbs around. So if you do get 4 stacks of this by the end of the delve, that's great, but by then, you just won't need it anymore, right? You pretty much clear the delve. So yeah, I think this is just not a good curio. I cannot see anyone picking this. You know, I would rather see them create a third defensive curio slot where this would be a better fit. But yeah, for now, just avoid this curio entirely. Next up is Karja's Cola Carrier. Mislaid Curiosities now have a 50% chance to contain 2 Karja Colas, and once per delve, Bran summons a Karja 6-pack when creating campfires. There are various Karja Cola flavors, and each of it has its own effect that applies when collected. So the effects I've seen so far was like 4% secondary stat. So at the start of the delve, for example, I think you can get like 4% crit, 4% haste, 4% burst, right? And throughout the delve, if you keep collecting curiosities, right, there's a 50% chance to get additional buff. And by the end of the delve, I think I got something like a 20% ish total, secondary stats, so it's not too bad. However, if you don't like to stop and collect those curiosities, if you think that just slows you down and you just like to hold W, this won't be a great curio, right? It's just not great because you have to go and collect them, and it's only 50% chance. So if it doesn't proc, you just won't have anything. So again, very inconsistent curio. I would say give it a go, but I don't think this will be used as much. Next up is Loot Radar. Every 30 seconds or 5 seconds after entering combat, scan the environment, highlighting mislaid curiosities and making enemies below 95% health take 10% more damage for 15 seconds. I like this curio. It's very simple, it's very fair. There's no gimmicks like, hey, you have to first collect a bunch of herbs or some stacks before you actually get to use the curio. There's no risk of it like falling off or you losing the buff. It's very visual. You can clearly see when the scan is going off, and the only requirement to sort of like activate it is that you need to damage the mobs a little bit below 95%. So start of the combat, you have 5 seconds to basically damage them, which is pretty fair. So I like this curio a lot. While it might not be the meta pick, I think it's definitely viable and I recommend giving it a go. Next up is Overdrive Pylon, and this is probably one of the most strongest curios in season 2. And to understand why is it overpowered, you need to understand how it works. So the tooltip says after 30 seconds of combat, party members and brand deal 20% more damage and healing for 40 seconds. It can only occur once per combat. Now there's two parts to this curio, right? First is the combat tracker, which basically means the only requirement to activate this curio is to stay in combat for 30 seconds. And after that, you get a 40 or 20% damage buff that lasts 40 seconds. That damage buff is not tied to combat, it's just the damage you get on the character and it stays for you 40 seconds, which basically means the best way to utilize this curio is to stay in combat for 30 seconds, get the damage buff, and then finish the combat, kill the mobs, whatever, reset the combat and stack the next one. Now, be careful, you never want to drop out of combat before the 30-second mark, otherwise you will not get the damage buff and you'll have to, reset it. So the way to use this curio is really just, chain the mobs until you get the damage buff, and then you wanna kill them and start a new combat to reset the timer and keep the damage buff, refreshed as often as possible. Yeah, this is stupidly overpowered curio. I won't be surprised if it gets nerfed, but at the start of the season, get your hands on it and abuse it as much as possible. It's a nice curio to just basically hold W, and the only thing you need to watch out is to make sure you kind of reset the combat after 30 seconds. Once you get the buff, you're good to reset the combat and start the next back. So yeah, really good curio. I'm looking forward to using this one, but it might get nerfed, so watch out. Next up is a pacifist rig, and yes, you guessed it, we are getting a mech. Yeah, this is a super cool curio, and there's a few reasons for that. First up, it deals tons of damage. You get close to mobs and they just get evaporated, and the second one is actually the proc chance was pretty high, so you would get to use it through majority of the health, which is pretty good. It only lasted 10 seconds though, and so you need to kind of act fast. The mech's movement speed is a bit slow, but hey, if it spawns quite often, then it's no problem, right? The second benefit of this mech was actually it has its own HP. And when you get it during like a boss fight, you basically completely negate the mechanic. You just go in melee and just burst the boss. So yeah, it was pretty good. In fact, this curio was already nerfed. Previously, it would last 20 seconds, but now it's down to 10. But yeah, it's still very strong curio. Give it a go. I definitely recommend it. And last utility curio is a 3-dimensional bioprinter. So damaging an elite creature below 40% creates an imperfect copy of it. At 100% power to fight by your side, only 2 copies can exist at the same time. Now, I won't go into this curio much because it's actually bugged at the point of testing, and the bioprints or the copies were not doing any damage. So it's very hard to say how strong this is, but I will say it is pretty funny. You get like copies of mini Bran running around, or like a mini mushroom, or whatever elite creature you copied. So it does has visual appeal, but there is no power associated at the moment. So maybe when it goes live, they'll fix it, and we'll know for sure how strong it is. For the moment, maybe pick it up and give it a go, but yeah, it has kind of zero power value at the moment. So yeah, so one of my top picks for the season 2 of the War Within. Well, for combat curious, I would go with automatic food bomb dispenser. Like I said, it deals tons of damage, especially if there's multiple mobs. You're just gonna evaporate all of them. Another passive choices could be Goblin Magnetic Bouncing Grenade. The stun is pretty nice, and you don't have to think about it. It's just extra damage that Bran would be dealing. You can also go with Pinged Augment Chip if you want a passive choice. And maybe situational option is a Mechasaur Easy Build Kit. Like I said, if you if you get the Bran Epic X spawn and you want to blast the Delph, as quickly as possible with those 4 dinosaurs, then give it a go. It might actually do more damage than the other options, but like I said, it's just not so consistent as the other 3. And for utility, I think the number 1 pick is Pacifist Risk, 100%. Just use it until it gets nerfed. It's just absolute. It's an absolute bomb. It destroys everything, and it procs pretty often as well. And the second option, once that gets nerfed, is an Overdrive Pylon. Against 20% flat damage increase once you learn how to utilize it correctly. Yeah, and if you don't have that, you can give it a go, biofuel if your haste is high, if you're a haste user, or alternatively you can use Loot Radar, which is also a very safe 10% damage increase, every 15 seconds pretty much. So yeah, that's it. Well, yeah guys, let me know which Curios you end up using. I think they're overall better than the last season. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that, and yeah, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.